Hello, my name is Peter Raymer, and today we're going to be talking about how to create a D365 custom log. In the last article and video I wrote, I talked about info logs, warnings, and errors, and how helpful having those messages are in our code to help the user understand what went wrong with a particular process. There's certainly many other types of logging within D365, whether that be database logging or trace parser or those info log messages. But sometimes there's cases where I have found having a custom log table can be very powerful, and using that log table with a workbench can help speed up that process. Oftentimes you might have complex integrations such as a sales order or something else coming from an external system into D365 into maybe a staging table, and then from there you turn that staging table into a sales order, maybe you're invoicing it. There can be an awful lot going on, and even when you run that process in a batch job and you've got info log messages being printed to that batch job, sometimes if a record goes poorly or doesn't process, it can be a lot of infolog messages to sort through to try to figure out what went wrong with a single sales order, especially if a lot of transactions are being processed, or say users are working on many different transactions that are coming in from an outside system, maybe thousands a day, and the error messages could be really varied. So let's jump in and let's look at maybe how we would create a custom log and kind of see how it would be beneficial. So first I'll jump back to Visual Studio, and if you haven't already, create a new project essentially, and then create a new table called custom log. We'll start with that. In this custom log table, you can give it a label and all the rest, a caption, call it custom log. From there, you can add multiple fields. I would recommend you add a field called message. You can give it a long or an extended data type of long description. That'll give you 350 characters for that message. You can certainly use a memo field or something to make that message even longer and go from there. So we've got a message field to store our info log message. The next thing I recommend you create is a log ref rec ID int64. So this is going to be a reference back to whatever the record is, a transaction, a sales order, a sales line, whatever you're processing. This can point back to that record so we know which record this message belongs to. After that, I did create 3 integer fields. We'll actually cover that in a separate lesson, so I'm going to skip those for now. What we really need is this message field and the log ref rec ID. But one thing that I really want to call out is that what's great about a custom log table is you can store additional values in their own fields for specific purposes. So unlike just a message, just a string, you can actually just store values, maybe it's sales order totals or a customer ID, in their own field to help you understand more of what's going on, to filter these logs, and you'll see that in a little bit. Okay, next you can add a field group called all and drag all of your fields into this field group. That'll be helpful later when we're creating our form. All right, now we've got a custom log. We want a log method. So go ahead and create a new method on this custom log table called log that takes a long description message as well as a ref rec ID. And then from here we can create a new table buffer of type custom log. We can set the message to whatever you pass in, the ref rec ID, and then insert that record. So this just helps us. We could write this in our process, but instead of writing 4 lines of code every single time we need to log a message, we've just got this little helper method that's going to help us with that. All right. Now that we've got our custom log table, we really need to set up some kind of workbench to demonstrate this. You don't have to use a workbench. You could have your own process example where you're using this. You'll see as we get further along how this can be helpful. But I want to show you how you can create a workbench, and the workbench itself I think is helpful for many people who deal with transactions or integrations that require a lot of reviewing. So I'm going to go ahead and create a table called transaction table. For this example, you can of course replace this with your own. Within transaction table, you can pretend that this is your staging table. This is what the outside system is inserting into, maybe again a sales order with some sales lines or something else that you want to first get into the system before you try to create a sales order or validate anything. Sometimes it's very helpful to stage it and then do that error handling secondary instead of trying to do it all at once and throw errors back to the calling system. So in this case, I created a table called transaction table. I gave it another label of transaction table. I then added one string field called transaction ID so that I could know what is the unique identifier in this. And then I didn't actually add any more fields. This is just a pretend example, so you can go from there. All right, after that, we actually can go back to the custom log table and add a relation up to transaction table. So the way you add a relation is you right click on this node, say new relation. It'll create a new node here. You want to give it the name of whatever table you're trying to relate to as a best practice. So name it transaction table and then set this related table to transaction table. After you've done that, and it's very important you set the related table first, then right click on this node and say new normal. This is where we're going to specify what are the field relationships. As if you were writing a select statement in SQL or anything else, this is where we need to specify how these two tables relate. So say new normal. It will create a new table, and then you can specify the field as log ref rec ID and then the related field as rec ID. And to make sure we did this correctly, we can kind of see that full picture right here in this text. Make sure that this makes sense. And in this case, this is true. We're saying that any messages that get logged in this log table should have a log ref rec ID that matches the rec ID of the transaction table. All right. Now we need to create a new form for this workbench so that we can see our transactions and the logs that go with that transaction right next to each other. This will make more sense in a second. So go ahead and create a new form. In this case, I called it transaction table. Then add both the custom log table and the transaction log table as data sources into this data sources node. You just drag them over there. Then here's the trick here, and we haven't talked about this much. Hopefully I can go into more detail on a separate video, but we actually need to join these two tables together. That way they're tied together. When I select a transaction from one grid, I want it to filter and show only the logs that are related to that transaction record that I've got selected in a second grid. And so in order to do that, you select the custom log table. This is kind of our child table, as I like to think about it. And then to relate it back to the parent, we need to set the join source to our parent. So I just picked transaction table. I can leave this link type alone as delayed, and then simply by me having the relation that we just added to the custom log table, it will know how to join these tables together. I don't have to specify that where clause, that join criteria. The system's going to do it for me because it sees that I have a relation between these two tables. All right, great. We've got a form, a workbench form with these two tables. Again, what we're looking for here is we're going to have two grids with this transaction tab and logs tab, and you'll see it more in a second. All right, next come to the design and right click on the design, and it won't show for me right now. It'll show remove pattern, but when you're first doing this, click apply pattern and then select simple details with standard tabs. So we're just creating some simple grids but with two tabs. After that, as part of the best practices of following this pattern, if I move it back over to here, we need to add an action pane, also called an application bar. So right click on this and say new application pane, and you can add it there. After that, you'll see that we need a tab control, which is this body right here. So right click and say new, and then find tab in this list here, all the way down here. So we've added both of those. After that, we actually need two tab pages. So right click on this tab, say new tab page, and you can do that twice. We're going to create one for our transaction tab and one for our logs tab and put a grid inside of it. So once we have that tab page, we need to give it a caption. If we don't, then it may not show up or show as blank. So type in transaction for the first tab page and then type in logs for the second tab page. After we've done that, we want a grid on each one of these tab pages. So right click and say new, and then select grid, and it'll add a grid control to the tab, and do that for each of these two tab pages, this first one and the second one. Now we need to add our fields to the grid, and so specifically I want to add the transaction fields to this first grid. So you can just expand the transaction table data source over here on the left and drag it on top of the grid. I'm not going to do it right now because it'll add a second one, but then it'll create this transaction ID string control for you. It'll do the work of setting the data source and the data field for you, so it's much easier to drag it than it is to right click and say new string control. Then I want to add all of my log fields. I could similarly, expand my fields on custom log and drag each one of those over underneath the grid. But if we created that all field group, it's easier to just expand the field groups, drag that all group onto my grid. Now I get all of my messages. Again, you may not have these last three. That's okay. We just really need these first two for this example. All right. We've got most of what we need. The other thing that we should do is if we go back to the custom log data source, I recommend you set the allow create, allow delete, allow edit, insert at end, and insert if empty all to no. We want to override those values. Basically, a log is not something that we expect the user to import into or insert or type into that grid. We really just want this grid to be read only, and setting all those does that for us. Similarly, we could set the insert at end, insert if empty on the transaction table, and arguably maybe the same ones as well to no. I'll leave these set to yes so that I can manually create a record, kind of simulating an integration, creating those records to show you this example. All right, if we were to compile this now, we'd have a form and a table that's going to show these two values. We need a couple more things before we can fully demonstrate this. We need to create a display menu item. So, right click, add new item, and then you can select display menu item. I always like to call it the same thing, so transaction table again. And then once you have that, right click, select the properties, and then we need to set two things. We need to set the object to the name of our form, in this case transaction table, and then we also need to set the label to be transaction workbench. All right, we've got a menu item. That's the URL, the blue text that shows on our front page, allowing us to access this form. And then lastly, we need to add this menu item to a menu. So I'm going to go ahead and add it to the accounts receivable menu. So if you go into your Application Explorer, search for accounts receivable, you can see that there is a menu called accounts receivable. From there, we need to extend this menu if we haven't already. So right click and say create extension. I've actually already done that. So there is one called Dynamics 365 Musings already. I right clicked and added that to my project. You can see it here. Then you can open it, and then from here we can actually drag this menu item onto this menu. I created a new submenu called transaction. I gave it a label of transaction, and then I dragged this one here, which sets my menu item type and menu item name all for me. So great. We've got our form, menu item, our table, everything's kind of ready except our process and our logging to that logging table. So all of this was a huge setup to show you further what we want to do. So lastly, on the form, this transaction table form, go back to this action pane, right click and add a button group control, and then right click on this button group and say new button. So we added a new button, and then this button is allowed to have some text. It's always a little confusing whether it's text or label or caption. In the case of buttons, it's called text. I'm going to put the text, set it to process. You can name it whatever you want, but we're pretending that a process is being run. Now maybe this would normally run in batch, maybe you're clicking on it to run it, but we're just clicking on it to show you what it does directly. But yeah, in general you may have a batch job that's running this core code. So let's go ahead and add that. Then right click on the method and say override, and then select the clicked method. Since I've already overridden the clicked method, it's not going to show up in my drop down there anymore. But then once you do, you'll have a click method here. You can double click on it to go to the code behind this form and see what code we've got here. So I'll make the window a little bigger here so you can see it. Essentially, what this click method does is it calls our helper method, so custom log : log, and then specifically we're passing it a message telling it what transaction we're beginning to process, essentially simulating we're doing some complex process. From there, I might have a dozen different logs, or logs if an error happens or something else goes wrong. But by me calling this helper method and inserting those logs as data, it allows me to see it much easier later on. One last thing before we view it is we do want this custom log _ds, which refers to the data source on our form, .execute query. What that's going to do is cause the form, when you click this button, to reread the records in this table and display them in the grid if they exist. Technically, we don't need these two with the code that I have, but if we were to say update the transaction table with a new status like complete, or with the sales order ID that we created, we would want to have a reread refresh to reread that. So okay, we are done with that process. Now we can come back to our form. After building and reloading our browser, we can come into this form. I can create a new record, kind of simulating like a new transaction came in. I'll do 5555. I'll click save. From initially, when I do this, there aren't any logs in this otherwise related record, but if I click process, it's going to run our clicked method code. And you can remember there wasn't really much in there, but we can pretend that this ran a complex process with lots of code and lots of log messages throughout that code to help me understand what went on. From there, if this transaction maybe failed, it didn't make it to completion, I can come over to this logs tab and see all of my error messages. I can sort by the created date time. I forgot to mention that, but we can set the created date time property on the custom log table to true. That gets us this created date time field. And then I can see my message that directly relates to my transaction. So this is just really helpful. If I had a dozen different messages per transaction, I wouldn't need to sort through a really long info log on a batch job. I could just see the info log messages relating to this particular transaction and ignore all the others. But this is going to help me troubleshoot this that much faster. Then I can make this even better if I wanted to. Maybe I still want to print out the messages to the screen so that they get logged to the info log or to a batch job. Well, I can do that as well. So what I did is I went back to this custom log table. I created another log and show, or another method called log and show. So I'll double click on that. And it's very similar to our existing log message, but instead this one takes an optional third parameter called info. And then if info is set to true, I can call info and print out the message that we passed in. So certainly I could have just called info in my code alongside this log and show, but now I'm having to make two calls instead of one. So this kind of just combines both steps into one. From there I can go back to my form. I can add another button and override the clicked method and do the same thing as I did before, but in this case just call log and show. And if I were to show you how that works, we come back into here, we can create a new record. We'll call it 7777. I'll hit save. I can hit process, whoops, or maybe I'll hit process and show. When I do that, now I get the info log as well as my logs printing out my message. So super helpful. If I want to prove to myself that we still have all these records, right? Certainly I can go back to another record and see those messages. I can also refresh my table browser by adding this little text at the end, the MI equals sys table browser, ampersand table name equals custom log, and I can see all my different messages that I've got inside this system. And then again, this is just really helpful for the case where I want to store multiple values. I want to see messages only relating to the failed records, the ones that I'm troubleshooting using this workbench. There's some other applications for having a custom log table, such as for performance or for capturing error messages that are thrown by the base system, and so I'll cover those in one of the next videos and articles. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you watching. If you liked the video, click the like button. I also invite you to push the subscribe button as well. If there's other topics you would like to see a video on, please post in the comments and I'll see what I can do. I hope you learned something new today. Thank you.